Welcome to another special episode of One and Dunn podcast. We're here at NAMM 2025. My guest today is Ryan Dusick. He's a founding member of Maroon 5, and he is now a therapist, coach, and speaker. He's a book author, and he has his own podcast, Harder to Breathe. Welcome, Ryan. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah. So we first thought about asking you to come be part of this podcast because we talk a lot about mental health, and your name came up and you could do it. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure.
So we talk a lot about when people get into music, it's like their lifelong dream, right? And so that's all they've ever wanted to do, and they get in there. And then sometimes things happen and they have to change roles, do something new. So that's kind of what happened to you, right? So what happened and how were you able to successfully change from your dream job to something else that you thoroughly enjoy?
It was a tough, long road to overcome and deal with the loss, the grief of losing not just the career that I had as a musician, but the identity.
I was going to say, yeah, because you've become your job. I mean, it's so ingrained, right?
Exactly. I mean, I had dreamt of being a rock star, since I was a teenager. And actually, we started the band when I was 16 years old.
Yeah.
Adam Levine was 14. We were kids, and we were just having fantasies of being, at the time, it was the 90s. We wanted to be the next Pearl Jam.
Sure,
that was our band, and we spent a decade chasing that dream. And you can imagine along the way of that, like all the ways that we grew up as young men and bonded as a group, and just how much that became a part of my identity and my self-definition and my self-worth and self-esteem. And so I ran into problems on the road when we finally did have success on the album Songs About Jane, which was the first Maroon 5 album. And the first few years were okay, but it was just a very taxing, long, stressful experience on my body in particular, because I never really learned proper techniques. So that was one element that was challenging. Was just I was putting a lot of strain on my joints. And then also I'm just, as a person, I put a lot of pressure on myself, kind of an anxious, overachieving perfectionist as a kid growing up. And then you put that on the road every night, having to perform to that level, and the pressures that come along externally of having to do that over and over and over again on bigger and bigger stages and having to be on all the time.
That is really hard too, that feeling of being on. It's exhausting.
Yeah, well, I'm an introvert by nature. I mean, I have an extroverted side, for sure, but I need my space and I need my downtime to recharge. And at a certain point, there just was no ability to find that on the road because there was no downtime.
Right.
And so I had to learn to adapt, and I didn't do a great job at adapt. I was a little late at that point because my coping skills weren't great. And I was having physical pain and a lot of things that really compounded the experience for me. And so eventually, anyway, the long story short is that my body broke down to the point that I couldn't play the drums anymore. And we tried for me to come back until eventually I had to leave the band. And so that was devastating because it was literally like the dream that we'd been pursuing for a decade plus finally coming true and then having to walk away from it. So I'd like to say that the transition was very smooth, that I figured out how to get past that and just find new purpose in life immediately. But it took me about a decade after that to deal with the grief of that loss, deal with the depression that came from that loss, and the substance abuse. I was abusing alcohol, and then mental health challenges that existed before that and were a big part of my breakdown, but actually got worse afterwards because I was in such a dark place that I didn't really have any coping skills. So it was finding recovery from alcoholism that led to recovery from all of these other elements of my mental health that were difficult for me. And in that process of recovery is when I was able to find new meaning and purpose in my life. And that was in the mental health field.
So you lose your sense of self, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything you've always thought you were is gone, and that's a tough thing to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it was really. People always imagine, well, you're having all this success and you're having the money and the adulation and all these wonderful accomplishments, and you must really miss that. It's like, yeah, of course I missed that, but that's not what I miss most. What was most difficult was the loss of my family. That was the band.
Yeah.
The connection, the sense of purpose that came along from the creative process. We created this thing that was Maroon 5 and built it for over a decade together. And there was a real sense of meaning in that, and in purpose, and this familial connection. And so that was deeper than just an accomplishment and some external gratification of what the validation that comes from success. It was something that was more to the core of my self-definition.
Yeah.
So that was really hard to lose.
How do you replace the creativity with music and being a drummer? Did you find something to replace that in your life? And what is that?
I tried for years after I left the band to maintain that connection to music, and I was doing writing and producing, and that was enjoyable and definitely was helpful in terms of maintaining some sense of connection and purpose. But that was challenging in and of itself, because everything I would do, I was comparing to the experience I had already had, which was a magical one that most people don't get to experience in their life. And then also they were still doing it and at a bigger and bigger level.
Yeah.
And so I make this little indie record and I think it's pretty good. And then they have a multi-platinum arena size, album and tour. And so it just kind of felt futile, for me to be doing what I was doing. And granted, I was in the best place to be able to deal with that and make sense of it. So that was challenging. I think for me, the creativity really came back when I was in recovery and I started studying mental psychology. I went back to school to get a master's degree in clinical.
Why did you choose that?
Well, I was at first just doing it for my own recovery. I was part of my recovery was volunteering at a recovery center. And I was just running groups and being of service, and found a new passion in that. But I started getting a lot of really positive feedback about my ability to just be sort of empathically connected to the newcomers and to articulate the ideas of recovery to them. So that felt good for me to feel like I had something to offer again. And I hadn't really considered another career, but then it just kind of made a lot of sense. Like, maybe I should do this for a career. And because I was in a better place, I saw opportunity and I went with it. So I just applied to a graduate program in psychology. And the next thing I'm on my way to getting my master's degree and becoming a therapist. And then writing my book, which was an outgrowth of that. And that's where the creativity came back, because writing the book was like a very cathartic, creative process of finding closure on that chapter of my life and beginning a new one.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what the book's about?
Yeah, it's called Harder to Breathe, the memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. A lot of that is in the title, but it's a memoir that, about half of it is about the band. So there's a lot of stuff in there. If you're a music fan, if you're curious about the behind the scenes of a band on the rise and a band finally reaching success, there's a lot of the stories you want to hear, but the overarching theme is my mental health journey. It was really an effort on my part to share the things that I've learned in my recovery without being too over the top about it. It's not like a heavy-handed, you need to do this. It's really just my story. And at the end, there's some lessons learned, but essentially just taking the reader through my experience and hoping that if they can connect with what I went through, then they can see the hope in my recovery. So that was the intent. It really was just service. It's the same way that you get up at an AA meeting and you tell your story and you hope it affects somebody, kind of that. But the added benefit is that I actually do have some training in this stuff and education. So I was able to do it from the perspective of a clinician now, of a therapist. And so I kind of show the seeds of what became a problem later in life in the first parts of the book. And then you see how the things become a problem, how they develop, and how I dealt with them, not always in the best way. And then eventually, of course, in the last part of the book, how I found ways to cope better.
Right. Do you think it seems like mental health and mental health challenges seem to be more out in the open and talk a lot about it on tours and stuff? Do you think that, no, not physically, but just mentally, if you'd had the resources that are out there now, that it would have helped you when you were touring and with the band?
I'd like to think so. I mean, you have to remember this was 20 years ago when I was on the road struggling. The conversation that we're having now about mental health was pretty non-existent.
Nobody talked about it.
No, quite the contrary, actually. If you were to talk about it, that might be the end of your career.
Yeah.
Because they'd be like, people would think, what's wrong with him? Or, you know,
Yeah.
you don't want to be a liability.
Right.
But now I think it's amazing that you're seeing a lot of artists talking about this stuff and sharing vulnerably, because people coming up see that and they recognize, like, okay, well, maybe I'm not alone that I feel anxious or depressed, or that I'm feeling the pressure and it's getting to me, or feel overwhelmed and exhausted. And then you can start to find some tools to deal with those things if there's not the stigma of admitting that you're feeling vulnerable. So I think that if some of the things that we're doing now existed when I was on the road, that certainly, it couldn't have hurt, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It was just given the opportunity to have access to some tools and resources that I didn't have access to.
Now, are your clients, are they mainly music involved, or do you?
I have clients, I do have a few clients in the music industry, artists, songwriters, managers, record label. I have one that runs a record label. I didn't necessarily pick that. That wasn't going to be my focus, that I was only going to work in the music industry. But it just seemed to kind of make sense and work out that way because of my past. And I went out and wrote a book about my life, so that kind of brought some attention to that. Right. And now that I'm licensed, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to focus on, you work with the demographic that the people that you can relate to. So I'm still kind of refining exactly what the niche will be, but it's definitely a big part of it.
Are there any commonalities between the different people in music, things that you see that is just across the board that, you have advice for, just if someone's facing similar problems?
Well, creative people tend to have a lot in common in terms of they're sensitive people to begin with. They have some tools that a lot of people don't have in terms of having a connection to their feelings, having an outlet. Creativity is a great way to express what's going on inside of you. And artists are people that found that outlet. So that's a great tool to work from. However, a lot of times they have the same challenges. If that's your proclivity and you are a feeling person, you sometimes can be more susceptible to the things that can be challenging. But I also see connections, not just in terms of musicians or actual entertainers, but just people that are in positions of high performance in general. Like I have a couple clients I have one who's a CEO of a company that's not in the music industry. And he's a totally different type of person in terms of the feeling person versus the person that doesn't have a lot of connection to their emotions. But the challenges are the same in terms of work-life balance. How do you deal with the stress and the pressure of performance, of having to be on all the time, or having to, like for me, it was, you're going on stage again in front of 20,000 people tonight. And how are you going to get yourself together to be able to be your most dynamic self, no matter what you're feeling or how exhausted you are? I think that people can relate to that on different levels in any industry. When you show up to work and you have to perform in a certain way, especially when you're in a high position of responsibility, are you keeping yourself together to be able to do that? And what are your issues that you're bringing into that? Right? Because we all have issues one way or another. If you're not one way, you're another way. So, but I think for people that are performers, in particular ones that have success, there are issues that are very specific to that in terms of your world can be very isolated. You can kind of live in a little bubble, and then you get enabled in a lot of ways when you're successful or famous. And so there are challenges that are inherent to that is unique to the general public, because most of us don't have people walking around picking up after us and doing everything that we tell them to do, or saying yes to everything. So yeah, there are similarities, but also some things that are unique to that population for sure.
So one thing that I talk a lot about is change and how change can be really hard. So we talked earlier about, if this has been your passion forever, what happens? Like in the industry right now, engineers, producers, there's less work. So some of them need to consider another career, but they're living their dream, but it's not working out. So I know when the pandemic first happened, all my event business went away. So what do? So I spent a few days just like very unhappy and just not knowing. And then I decided to go virtual and start doing all this virtual stuff. I hate being on camera, as these guys can attest to. I like being behind the scenes, but I thought if I don't do something, I wouldn't have anything. So I had to think about it mentally and just decide, okay, I'm just going to go for it. But what do you suggest to people an engineer who can't find work right now and they can't pay their bills? How do they not lose their identity? How do they not feel like a failure because they can't make a living at what they've chosen and what their passion is, and they have to go do something else?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And that was a very resilient response that you had to be able to shift that quickly into a different way of functioning. It seems like your whole world was built around live events.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you can't do that. You shift into this other thing. I mean, a lot of people would struggle with that. They would not have the ability to just make a left turn like that quickly. I think for me, what's helpful in looking back and why that loss of identity was so difficult, it was because I had put all of my eggs in that basket, not just in terms of career, in terms of like the focus of where I was spending my time, but emotionally and psychologically investing in that as defining of me. And I think that no matter how passionate you are about one thing in your life, and whatever your priorities are, you're more than just that one thing. And even if that one thing doesn't end up being as successful as you hope that it would be, or you have success and then it's not as successful at a certain point and you have to walk away from it, that's not the end of who you are.
But how do you know? I mean, it's easy to say that, right? And I can say that to myself, but actually to believe it, how do you transition from that?
Well, it is tough because if you hit that moment and you haven't done any of the work beforehand, then obviously you're not going to know in that moment that you are more than that. Right. You're going to feel like your self-definition is gone. The thing that defined you is gone. So that's why, I mean, in general, I like to think proactively rather than reactively. It's like for artists that are pursuing this stuff wholeheartedly and putting their entire self into it, that's wonderful. Go for your dream, do it 100%. But remember that you're more than that. And remember what matters to you beyond whether or not this thing is successful or not, because that's what is going to give you the ability to shift and adapt to whatever comes from this, right? So you're asking, like, what do you do if you haven't done that work? And now you have to do that work in a moment's notice because you don't have. So I mean, obviously, the work of therapy and finding support is very important because none of us can do any of this stuff alone. You obviously, there's the phrase, no man is an island, right? I think that whether you're struggling with substance abuse or you're struggling with anxiety or you're struggling with any kind of mental health issue you're dealing with, or this particular idea of identity or grief or loss, doing it alone is going to be that much more challenging, right? So the first thing is feeling that you're not alone, finding some way to connect to other people that are maybe going through the same thing, or people who do know that you're more than just your success or this thing, and knowing it, there are people that can lift me up and can give me a sense of what life can be beyond this. If you're left to your own devices, a lot of times you're just going to spiral downward, right? Yeah. Right. So that's the reason why for alcoholics we have 12-step groups and this type of thing. And I think that the work is self-compassion, having compassion for self, recognizing.
Which is another hard thing.
It is a challenge. We don't learn that. It's like not something they teach us in school. It's something a lot of times we either got it from our parents giving us compassion and we learned self-compassion, or sometimes we have to learn it for the first time after we've struggled for a long time and find it for the first time. But self-compassion is the starting point of so much, because it allows us the grace to be able to approach things without making it worse on ourselves. Because the worst thing we can do, of course, is we're already in a difficult situation and then we beat ourselves up.
Right. Yeah.
And that actually makes it more difficult. And that's what creates that downward spiral. So if you have a little bit of compassion for yourself, and recognize, like, yeah, this is a really difficult thing. This is not an easy thing. And even if I do have to do some things right now that I didn't want to do, it doesn't mean that I'm failing. It doesn't mean that my worth is gone. It just means that I'm going to have to adapt. And it doesn't mean that that identity that is connected to this thing that I love so much and is my purpose is gone. It just means it has to evolve, right? So giving yourself the grace to do that. And I know that's, again, easier said than done, but that's kind of the work of therapy. That I work with people on this all the time at different levels. You know, people that are at the highest level of success and then have a moment where they're in crisis and they have to adapt. Or people who never reach that level and have to find a place of acceptance of, like, what is my life going to be if it's not going to be that dream that I had imagined? Yeah.
So how do people go about finding a therapist? I know there's a bunch of online stuff now, and you can look on your phone, but I don't want to go talk to anybody, right? I don't want to go talk to someone I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and it's a struggle anyway, because you're admitting that there's an issue, right? And you're trying to find help. So, do you have any suggestions on the best way to find a therapist?
Well, I think it's really important. Look, finding a therapist is like any other relationship in your life. It has to be the right person at the right moment in your life. It's like picking a partner, whether it's a romantic partner or a friend or a business partner or a whatever kind of partner. Like, this is a really important partnership. This is somebody you're going to be collaborating with on your own well-being.
Right.
The most important thing in your life, right? So it is a big decision in who you pick. And a lot of times the first person you go to is not the right person. So sometimes there is some trial and error that goes into it. You have to try out a few different options. And it's okay to say this is not a good fit. You don't have to dive headfirst into it and go, I'm going to make this work. If it's not working, find somebody who you have a better fit with. You do have to do that. But it's helpful to find somebody you do feel a connection with. And that could be somebody that has something in common with you or focuses on the areas that you're seeking help. Or it could just be that you need somebody who is opposite from that and you need a fresh perspective.
Right.
For what we're talking about in terms of the music industry, I'm a part of something that's called the Music Industry Therapist Collective. And there are other organizations like this, but this is a unique collective of people who formerly worked in the music industry and went back to school to become therapists to work specifically with people in the music industry, and not just performers, crew members, people at record labels, managers, that type of thing. So that's another thing that didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, if you have a resource like that and you know going in, well, I don't know if this is going to be the perfect person, but at the very least, they have experience with what I'm going through, either literally, personally, or they work with other people that are in the same position as me. You kind of have more of a buy-in right off the bat where you're like, okay, well,
because they get you already, right?
They get you, yeah. I mean, even me, like, my experience is going to be different. I have colleagues in the collective that worked at record labels or worked in touring. You know, they were agents or tour managers, and now they're therapists, and they're going to have perspectives that me as a performer and artist don't have in terms of the behind the scenes work. So finding somebody who is most familiar with your particular set of challenges, because there is no one therapist that's right for everyone.
Right. And then this organization, you can be touring, and they have therapists all over the world, right?
Yeah. It's a global thing now in Europe, all over the country, and it's growing rapidly. Yeah. I've only been a member for 2 years, I think. And it's only been around for 5 or 6 years, I think.
This whole idea is just so new.
It's so new. Yeah, and it's amazing to see how an idea that's a good idea and something you're like, oh, why hasn't this existed?
Yeah.
It can grow quickly, and it can change things very quickly. And I'm hopeful that the paradigm is shifting in terms of what is available and just the awareness.
Yeah.
The awareness and education of these things.
Well, let's just touch for a second on the fires that are still going on. And there's been a lot of loss and destruction, and a lot of people have lost their homes. What's the best way for them to be able to deal with all this loss?
Yeah, well, this is such a challenging time, and it kind of goes back to that conversation about grief. Because a lot of times when we think of grief, we think of the loss of a loved one, bereavement, right? And that obviously is a big part of it. But the grief can be just as heavy for physical things, our home, things that are part of our self-definition in other ways, but also more importantly, again, identity, right? There are people right now that they didn't just lose their home, they lost the school that they went to, the church that they went to, the neighborhood that they spent 20, 30, 40, 50 years of their life in. And so it's bigger in some ways than just one thing. It's a whole lifetime of identity that's wrapped up in these things. And it's a process. It's not the kind of thing, again, it starts with self-compassion. It starts with giving yourself some grace, because if the expectation is, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm just going to accept this, and I'm going to be okay, I'm going to find a way to be okay, you're probably going to run into some coping styles that are not the healthiest, because you're probably just going to be in denial or finding ways to cope that are a little unproductive or self-destructive, as I was doing after I left the band. So giving yourself self-compassion and giving yourself the space to experience whatever emotions come. Obviously, there's a crisis still going on that we have to deal with. And a lot of times you can't even deal with the emotional stuff while you're still just dealing with, I got to figure out how to deal with the insurance company. Where am I staying for the next however period of time? Got to get my finances in order. It's disruptive on so many levels. And even for the people that are at the highest level of wealth, this is incredibly disruptive. But there's that undercurrent of the trauma that's going on. And that is something that can stay with you a lot longer. Crises happen, and hopefully if you're lucky enough to live through it and to find another life after that, that stuff, one way or another, gets resolved. But if you haven't resolved the trauma, that lingers. That can emotionally and psychologically continue to affect you. And so the first step is not pushing those feelings aside, allowing yourself to experience them and process them. Therapy is great for that. If you don't have the resources or time for that yet, just any kind of community resources where you can connect with people or people in your life that are a support system, a helpful support system. And this is important information for not just the people who are in the middle of it, but for the people that are peripheral, that are supporting these people. Our tendency is to want to fix, is to want to come in and give answers and here's what you should be doing. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is just listen and just offer someone the space to talk about what they're feeling, what they're going through, because that allows you to not feel like you're alone in this experience, that at least somebody is understanding or taking the time to care about what you're going through. And that is very healing. And then it's just a process of look, there's no timeline for grief, right? There's stages to grief. And I have a client that's going through that right now that lost his home. And at first you're in shock and you're in denial, and that's okay. That's part of the experience. And then sometimes it quickly turns to anger or a lot of other complicated emotions that might be like, I'm not supposed to be feeling that way, or I'm taking it out on so-and-so. And when I'm really angry at the fire or at God or whatever it is, that's all part of the process. Again, acceptance of, I don't have the answers right now. I just have to kind of be willing to process this right now. There's going to be time to get to that other stuff. Eventually, the end stage of grief is acceptance. I wish there was at the end of grief, there was like this wonderful pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's something I was, sad to find out in my grief that acceptance was the prize you get at the end of it, because it doesn't sound so wonderful, right? But it opens doors for you when you finally get there, because you've gone through that process and now you have closure on it, and you're able to realize that there, as hard as that experience was, there always are positive things that come from it. You grow from everything that's painful. You eventually find new purpose and meaning, new identity, and it gives you the opportunity to invest yourself in new things in that way. And that can be a wonderful process. But you can't skip steps. You can't go straight to that, and you can't tell someone, hey, just look at the bright side, you know, just find the good in this. And it's like, no, we're in the middle of a crisis right now. Let's stay where we're at and just be present and mindful and get through it the best we can with support and with allowing ourselves the grace to go through it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you. That was great advice. And thank you for being here. This has been wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.